Hello and welcome to the Good Practice podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Garner and this is episode 106, Evidence-Based Learning and Development. We last visited this topic way back in June 2017 when Mark Hendy joined us for what was to become one of our most popular episodes ever. So no pressure for this week's guest, learning and development consultant Mirjam Neelen. Hello Mirjam. Am I saying your name right?
Yes, it's actually perfect.
Great. I should have asked beforehand.
It actually sounded a bit Dutch, the way you pronounced it.
Well, I've been practicing. And we're joined, as usual, by regular contributor Owen Ferguson. Hello, Owen.
Hello.
Mirjam, you're a big advocate for evidence-informed approaches to learning design. This feels like it should be a mainstream approach that everyone does, but is it?
I don't think it is yet. And I think one of the reasons is that, I think our field is quite vulnerable because of its nature. Like everybody is a learner. So, a lot, like everybody and his uncle thinks they know about learning and how you learn best. So I think that's one of the things we are kind of like, that's kind of like a challenge for us. So I think that's why we're not there yet. And I think, well, to me, it's no surprise because if you look at the history of research in learning and training, like in the 20th century, it was still, quite faddish, like not very strong. So we didn't really have a way of doing it well. We kind of just took the orders in and we delivered, whatever was asked. But then when the research was catching up and we were able to use the evidence, then not everybody did it. But I mean, I think the good news is that we start to have more conversations around it. And I think more people, at least in my experience, more of my clients are interested in hearing about the evidence out there. And they're, very open to starting adapting their practices to that. And also, other learning professionals. I think it's becoming more open, and I think more people are willing to start looking at it, at learning design from a different perspective, like using the evidence. But mainstream, no, I don't think so. Not yet.
Well, there's a trend, I guess, isn't there, towards books and clickbaity titles kind of help with this, where you'll have like the surprising truth about how we learn and these kind of titles. There is an appetite for that maybe wasn't there before, and that maybe, even though some of it might be nonsense, it spreads the message that the traditional classroom format maybe isn't the best design that we could have.
Yeah, and but even in a classroom design, there is things that you can do effectively and things that will definitely be ineffective. So even when you need a more traditional approach, you can still use evidence. But I think you're right. I think there are, our field is changing a lot. Like finally, it took a long time, and it's still going quite slowly. But I think everybody starts to realize that we have to up our game to stay in business.
So when you talk about evidence being used in L&D, do you mean academic evidence that you're using to shape what you're doing, or are you looking at more on a sort of intervention by intervention basis?
Well, so if you look at the more like the evidence-based approach, which is more coming from the medical field, then they talk about three legs. They call it like the three-legged stool. So one is the evidence from research, so scientific evidence. The other is, the medical practitioners' expertise, so experience, judgment, and also they look at their patients, like their values and what they want, their preferences. So I think for learning, it's similar. Like you have three different types of evidence, but I think that's why I call it evidence informed, because I think our field is more nuanced. It's more difficult because we have a lot of qualitative data to work with. We have tons of variables that we're not able to control. So with my blog, the 3-star learning experiences, we focus on the scientific bit, just because I feel that needs a lot of attention still. I think a lot of people don't even realize we have a lot of evidence to work with. But of course, there's other types of evidence as well. Collecting data about your learners, interviewing them, or doing focus groups or surveys, or tracking their performance data, evaluating learning. So anyway, collecting tons of data is evidence for sure. And then, people's preferences, which is of course tricky in learning, right? Because you can't really follow preferences as such, because it might be detrimental to learning. But you can look at their preferences and see which ones you can accommodate for. So I think, but I focus on the scientific bit.
Sure. Owen, this sounds right up your street, and a lot of the stuff that you talk about regularly. Do you see a growing appetite for evidence in L&D?
Yeah, I think momentum is building, but evidence-based as a term is, I think sometimes it's in danger of obscuring the more fundamental thing that we're looking to achieve, because ultimately we want to know whether an approach works or not, and in what circumstances does that approach work. So you're kind of asking yourself, whenever you're designing something, how can I be confident that this intervention is going to have a positive effect on the thing that I am trying to change? And the difficult thing about that is that sometimes it means that you have to be willing to accept stuff that you've been doing probably for a long time hasn't been effective. You have to let go of stuff, and you have to accept that you will have made mistakes along the way inadvertently, as the evidence base for builds. But where that becomes challenging in an L&D context, and Mirjam highlighted this to a certain extent, is that there is good research evidence in some areas, but in general, and this is my personal view, when I look at the evidence for on the L&D and the HR side in the academic literature, it is relatively weak compared to even some other social sciences, and definitely compared to things like the medical sciences. So you kind of have to take, right, well, what's the best research evidence, but you also have to look at it with a slightly critical eye to say, right, the vast majority of that has unfortunately been performed on students because they are easy to bring into cohorts, into research cohorts, and so you need to find some other evidence, both stuff from within your organisation, and also use your own evidence that's come from other organisations, that you can get that might not be as high quality as scientific evidence, and merge it together to make a decision.
Yeah, and I think an iterative approach comes into play there as well, because so when I say using the evidence, I'm actually talking about very foundational strategies, for example. So we know that learning is a process. So when you just hammer out learning events, then you're not going to get there. You're just wasting your money. Things like spaced learning, variable practice, like these are all things that we know are more effective it's more effective if you do them than if you don't do them. So that's very simple, yet it still doesn't happen at a large scale in organizations. So I definitely think you need to leverage that type of evidence. And like people like Patty Shank, they've written and Will Thalheimer, they've done great work in making it practical and giving suggestions on how you can apply that and why you should be doing it. But then, yes, you're right. Like you need to, each context is different. Even the human beings in the, who might be learning together are different. So that were like the variables that I was talking about. So yeah, so then you need to start collecting evidence with that group of people to make sure that you're on the right track, which is not easy, right?
I don't want to ignore Owen's dig at the social sciences earlier on. I just want to put a regged flag that he said that the evidence behind learning research was weak, even for the social sciences. Just for all the social scientists out there, not to let him get away with it.
Well, no, I wonder if
here he goes. He defends himself.
Sorry, but the social sciences are slightly behind the curve, or they're a bit behind the curve compared to the hard sciences, and there's two reasons for that. One is that they've not been around in a sort of professional discipline context for as long, and the second is that, as Mirjam mentioned, they're more difficult to quantify. So there are good reasons why the research base is less strong. However, I would challenge people. I would be surprised if people could make a really strong argument for it being as strong as the physical sciences.
Well, if there's any social scientists out there that want to make that case, then I would love to hear from you. And Mirjam, you're a social scientist. Do you want to make that argument, or are you happy to concede?
I'm happy to concede.
Okay, I wonder how much of this is the people that work in learning and development tend not to have come from an academic background specializing in learning. I didn't. I came from a journalism background and kind of fell into this and have picked bits and pieces up along the way. But we're not a profession in the sense that you would go and study this necessarily for,
which
4
I
to
actually
10
think
years.
is one of the problems that we have. Because it makes it harder for people to gain that knowledge. And
yeah, exactly.
I know that expertise is kind of out of fashion, but I'm a big advocate for expertise and, increasing your knowledge in the field that you're working in. I think it's one of the things that you're just almost obligated to do to make sure you're able to contribute to the professionalism of the field.
When you say expertise is out of fashion, do you mean like the people have had enough of experts?
There's a lot of talk about that people need to have more generic skills, soft skills, that's more important than knowledge. And I couldn't disagree more. I'm not saying that it's not important to have those soft skills, but without the knowledge, I don't think you're going to get very far.
Yeah, sure.
Collaborating with somebody who doesn't know a thing is a pain in,
As my colleagues will tell you. So where would you go? If you're looking for the kind of evidence you can bring into your daily practice, what are good places to look for that?
Well,
your blog.
Sorry?
Your blog?
Of course. Yeah. No, but there's many other people who try to do the same thing. As I said, people like Patty Shank, Will Thalheimer, in the education space, it would be Pedro de Bruikere, he's Flemish. The learning scientists, these are all people who do really practical research to practice work that you can read. And Will Thalheimer has recorded videos. He creates great materials. It's not like you have to research the science itself necessarily, the literature. You can just start with, reading what other people have already done for you. And just to be more critical, I just wrote a blog about this. It's a previous blog about how you can start working in an evidence-informed manner. And I don't remember all 4, but I know it's strip it and flip it. So, because we're dealing with very not nuanced, strong statements. Everything's disruptive and transformational and, it's going to change the world. So just to be more critical with all the trends that we're dealing with would be a very good start.
It's a pet peeve of mine, transformational change. Yeah. I like incrementalism.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, most changes incremental, right?
We did a live show a few months back with at the CIPD L&D show with Phil Wilcox, and he argued that we don't need to evaluate everything. I think the point he was making was that we need to perform some level of evaluation for what Owen's talking about to see if the thing that we did achieved what we wanted it to. But that can be time consuming and expensive, and you need to kind of prioritize what you're going to evaluate. So what are your thoughts on that? How important is it we evaluate?
Well, I would agree you don't need to evaluate everything. I think it's already difficult enough to figure out what it is exactly that you need to evaluate to make sure that you're delivering, that you're making an impact. So, because, we're dealing with various layers or levels or whatever you want to call it. So you have hopefully a business problem that you're trying to solve, right? So that's something you need to measure ideally. Then you have people's performance, and then you have the learning. Because some people say you only need to measure the performance, which I don't agree with, because, if people start improving better, then how do you know because of what? Like, you don't really know. So I think the fact that we're dealing with all this complexity in the first place makes it even more important to be very critical about what you need to evaluate. So I would agree with that, and I would agree that it's difficult, especially like I've worked in various large organizations to find the data that you need. I'm struggling with that, like to even get accurate data or appropriate data.
I wonder what Owen thinks about that argument that we don't need to measure learning. It doesn't matter if anyone learns anything as long as performance improves.
I'm slightly torn on that, because you do want to know whether the fact.
Can I jump in? Let me add a little bit extra, because I'm interested in Mirjam's point of view that it's important that you have knowledge. There is an anti-knowledge trend just now where you don't actually need to know anything as long as whatever tool helps you do your job better. But knowing loads of stuff does tend to help in the long run. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this question.
Oh yeah, and that's that's how new knowledge is created. You synthesize, you transpose, you need to have that. I think the question becomes, for which things do you need to have knowledge? So being able to memorize all the prices in your product line, probably not particularly useful knowledge, given that you can look it up relatively easily. Understanding how to have an effective performance conversation, and the things that tend to work and have positive outcomes and the things that don't, that's useful to be able to recall on demand, if you will, and the quickest way of doing that is from memory. I'm not sure that it's always the case that you don't have to learn anything, and in the same way, I'm not entirely convinced. I think sometimes it's not worth gathering and analysing the evidence if it's not going to change the outcome, if it's not going to change what you actually do. If you're just doing something because you absolutely positively have to, then evaluation seems slightly pointless.
Do you mean like a data protection course or something like that? So you don't particularly have a problem with data protection. You are not regularly having data protection breaches, but you are forced to do such training. Maybe it's not worth evaluating.
Yeah, you're doing it because you're doing it, not because you're looking at something and saying we need to change this metric, or we need to reduce the number of this particular type of problem. If you're just doing it because you've been told you have to do it, well, that's little point in evaluating the outcome of that. I would suggest that why are you doing it in the first place would be a good question to ask, but there's something to be had there. But in general, I think it's worthwhile gathering evidence about interventions, even if you don't necessarily have an immediate need for it. And by that I mean you are collecting information about the efficacy of different kinds of interventions over time. So even if you're doing, you're implementing something, you're going to do it in a broad spectrum kind of way without running a controlled trial initially. At least you'll be able to look back at it and say, see that thing that we did that we thought was going to be really effective? It turns out it didn't work. So let's not do this new thing in exactly the same way as we did that old thing.
Mirjam, you were frowning for a lot of that, and then you kind of smiled at the end.
I'm thinking. Well, I was thinking about the privacy, or was it the
data protection example?
Data protection example, because I would agree that if you don't have problems with that necessarily, that you don't need to evaluate it. But then, yeah, I think it's a great question to ask. Then why would you do the training in the first place then? Because there is always an assumption that, and I think that is why evaluation is so important, because my hypothesis is that we can, skip a lot of training because we don't need it.
Yeah.
I think that's why evaluation could be great, to save money in the first place, because I think there's still a big tendency to default to training if there is some kind of either performance challenge or even a business problem. And, we need to find a way to make sure that training is the right solution. And evaluation is just one way of making sure it is.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, where I think evaluation is that it's most powerful is when you're running a trial, but you're genuinely running a trial. You're doing it under properly controlled circumstances, and you have not already made up your mind that you're going to do this intervention across everyone anyway. That you're using it to find out, should we do this thing? And if we do this thing, are there any changes that we need to make before we roll it out to a wider audience? That's when it becomes invaluable.
Yeah, I agree with that. What I do notice, though, because I try to work that way, what I do, so let's say when I do that, it's usually still, we start with some kind of face-to-face. Don't ask me why, it's just what happens most of the time. But to trial on learners somehow feels unethical to a certain extent as well, because I noticed that even when you try to work in a more agile way, you still have a tendency to deliver something that you feel is at least solid enough to put out to learners. And I find that difficult, because ideally you want to be even more agile and just experiment and try stuff out and then measure stuff and then make your decisions along the way. So I find that a challenge. So I don't know what.
But you're not necessarily. I mean, you're not, slinging random stuff at learners to see what sticks. Normally you would have some evidence base for the decision that you've made, and you're just seeing if it works. So it's the same as distributing pills to see what effect they have on a particular condition.
Yeah,
until
but still,
you get to such a point
activities
that you
need to be somehow solid. Like the content needs to be, developed to a certain extent. Like I find it hard to know where to stop when it's good enough to put it out.
Yeah. But if you are measuring the impact of that trial, and you find that it has a net positive impact, I mean, what you're guarding against is that it making either no difference or causing harm, and so for all there's an assumption that this well-constructed thing that theoretically we believe in, should work. We've got it's all built with the right principles. To make the assumption that will definitely have a positive impact, I think is one of the dangers. You should, for me personally, I think you keep your mind open to the potential that your brilliant idea turns out to be not quite so brilliant when you put it out into the real world, and that's what you're hedging against, and that's where the ethics come in. I think it's more ethical to be upfront and honest to say we're going to try this out and we think it will work, but we're not going to give it to everyone right at the start because that might be harmful.
Or, once you give it to everyone, it's difficult to disentangle your intervention from all the other stuff that's going on. There might be something else that, improve performance. We have chatted a little bit about collecting evidence, and we recently spoke on this podcast about XAPI, and we're looking for examples of how it had been used. Now, Mirjam, I have seen you mention online that you have used XAPI for a project. I'm interested in hearing a little about that.
Well, I do remember that there's some key learnings that I, gained from that. I was actually involved in 2 projects. But so, for example, I think Experience API, that's one of my learnings. It's just one way of gathering data, I think. And I think if you do it well, it's handy because everything goes to the same, the learning record source. So you have all your data in one place. But if you really want to implement it in an organization, then So from my experience, it worked best when we work bottom up. So when you really have a clear idea on what your learning outcome is or your performance outcome, and so you really know what you need to know, and based on that, you can then design your statements. So, but then if you want to roll it out at a larger scale, it becomes more tricky because you're dealing with all kinds of different systems who deliver all kinds of different types of data and how to make sure that that's all aligned. So I mean, I would be really curious to see what other people have been doing. I know there's a lot happening in that space. I think it's still happening mostly at a small scale, which makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, there's kind of two ways, I think, that you can evaluate learning data. And one is to have some sort of triggering event. So you've set up what it is that you want to measure and you're measuring that thing specifically. And the other way to go about it is just to collect absolutely everything. But then you end up with huge data sets. And, unless you know the context within which each part of that data set was generated, it's very difficult to interpret it at all. Can you give an example of what you were doing? You said you started from a bottom up. Are you able to talk about what that was?
So the application that we used was that people in an organization were collaborating on a project. And they all had an app. And they could tag what we call the more generic skills like creativity, collaboration. They could tag that while they were doing meetings with their team. So they could give their perception of how they experienced how these skills were used in that particular meeting. And then their manager had a dashboard with, so you could collect data over time. It's not just about that one meeting. You could collect data about how your team was experiencing those type of behaviors, from their other team members. And so it was more meant as a starting point for the manager to have conversations with their team and make plans around how you could then, how they could improve themselves. So our application was just that simple, tagging in a meeting, and then people could have discussions around it. But you could build that out, right? With if you would then have an intervention to improve X, Y, or Z, then you could collect that data as well. And you could then over time see if things improve.
That's interesting. That's using it for the analysis before an intervention. Really, you're kind of getting a picture of where you are.
And also because I think we were making very explicit as well that this was, just a starting point also to start having conversations around what actually happens and to make people more conscious about what actually happens when you do like project meetings. And so it was just a starting point. It was a very simple one, but it just helped to start thinking about how you could use this over time, because the data collection should be about the process, I'd say. Like, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to collect one event with Experience API.
Sure. It's an interesting example. It makes me think of two similar examples. One is that we spoke about it recently, is the data collected around sports. So you get sort of second by second performance data on basketball players, for example, and then you can use that to decide what's going to be done in training. The other is the Black Mirror episode where people rate each other out of 5 stars every couple seconds, and I wonder how my manager would feel if I was constantly rating him out of 5, for example. So I'm wondering what people's emotional reaction was to the idea of tagging through meetings.
Oh, there wasn't a rating. There was just, and it wasn't like it was based on the event as a social event. Like it was around the event and not about individuals.
Sure.
So I wasn't like rating you or somebody else. I was rating what was happening as a team.
Yeah,
Sure.
you'd be it would be observing particular behaviours happening in various different circumstances. So I'm seeing collaboration here. There's creativity. Exactly. There's a bit of conflict, whatever it might be. And as you collect that data over time, you're painting almost like a sort of mood picture of what's going on in the organisation, which gives you something to work on. Then you say, right, okay, so are we comfortable with the level of collaboration that we're seeing among the teams, and is that and when you put an intervention, then you're looking to see that metric change in some way.
Exactly. And I remember another very interesting implementation as well. It was just a case study that I've studied, which was, so they designed a training for paramedics. And they it was using simulated scenarios, but like real, like face-to-face, on the road type of scenarios. And they were using all kinds of devices that was around like the Internet of Things. So anyway, they could see how people behaved in this scenario, how they moved around, how close they were to the if there was a body on the street, how close they were, how everybody communicated with each other. So they could collect all that data while they were doing the training event. And then after that, they analyzed that and they used those insights to have reflective conversations with the people who did the training at that point, like who were going through the event, which I thought was quite clever, because you gather your evidence from how people behaved while they were doing the training, and then you can use that to help them reflect and give them feedback. And so I thought it was pretty clever implementation of using it.
Yeah, definitely. And an interesting use of, digital data collection followed up by a face-to-face discussion. I think we will wrap it up there and move on to our regular feature of What I Learned This Week, where we each share something that we picked up over the past 7 days. Mirjam, this is meant to be fun, this bit. So
I
won't grill you anymore. Well, you can be serious if you want.
Ross is saying that because he's usually got some triviality to share. That's...
Well, it's funny because, the first thing that came to my mind was we are renovating our bathroom. And so the first thing I wanted to say was, I learned that when you are replacing your shower room, that it needs to be tanked to make sure that you don't get any water, spread through your house. But then I thought, no, that's trivial and silly, so I'm not going to share that. So I came up with something else as well.
It's probably the most useful thing anyone's ever said on this podcast.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I say a more serious thing as well?
Sure.
Because I am currently working with a group of people on the LPI, Learning and Performance Institute capability map. And so what we're trying to do is revamp or refresh the capability map. And there's all kinds of different skills in that map. And it just made me realize, listening to all the people that we're working with and all the people who provided feedback, that I learned that even when you say I'm a learning professional, that can mean many different things. And I just noticed that everybody has a very specific area of expertise within that field, that same field. And I feel that sometimes you forget that all these different lenses, might it be more the data analytics side of things, performance consultancy, learning design, content creation and management, that these are all separate areas of expertise almost. And we just need to listen to each other better, I think, and leverage all these different levels of expertise.
Yeah.
So
it's almost like even within L&D, you've got cross-domain collaborations that could really enhance what it is that you're doing. You just need to know the experts in their own particular subdomains, to tap in and say, look, is there something that we can do together here?
Yes, exactly. Social learning, personal learning networks. I know a lot of people with very specific, great expertise that I can definitely use to get better. So, yeah.
Great. That was a great one. Owen, what have you got this week?
So I think this is probably the most relevant what I learned this week to the topic that we're speaking about that I've had. I read that the president of the Royal College of Surgeons has called for new surgical procedures, and implants, to be tested in clinical trials before being made routinely available. Now,
wow.
My first reaction to that is to think, aren't they already?
What the hell have they been doing so far?
What on earth has been going on? But it turns out that's not the case in surgery specifically. So surgery has always been slightly separate from more general medical sciences. And it brought to mind a quote that's attributed to Ben Goldacre. So he said to Tim Harford, "Whenever I look how it works in other fields, I conclude that it is bad in medicine, but worse everywhere else." And the other thing that I picked up from it was I often admire the ingenuity of how they go about testing these things, because one of the things that you might wonder is, how do you actually conduct clinical trials in surgery? And what they do is they conduct mock operations where they make incisions but they don't actually carry out the procedure. And so they use this approach to show that a common shoulder surgery was actually no more effective than a sham version of the same operation. And so he's putting out this call essentially to say, we are wasting lots of money conducting surgery that actually makes no difference whatsoever. I was flabbergasted, to be honest, to see just how far behind surgery appears to be.
Well, I think it has that reputation for, the cut them open, knee-jerk reaction to everything. But so the way they do this, they don't tell the patient that they haven't had the operation, though, do they? They just cut the shoulder open and then seal it back up and send them on their way.
Yeah, I mean, they've got their ethics committees to go through, so they will tell the patient that they're participating in a trial, but the patient will not know whether or not they've had the actual procedure.
Wow.
How interesting.
There's another example of, this is one they've conducted a number of years ago, where they wanted to find out if pacemakers were effective in a certain subclass of heart conditions. And so what they actually did was they fit a number of pacemakers but did not switch them on. It's quite an extreme way to go to conduct a trial, but the rationale behind that was that they were going to fit the pacemakers anyway, and what they wanted to do was to find out whether it actually had a positive impact on the patient.
Yeah, I mean, those things always sound quite extreme, don't they? Miriam's concerns about experimenting on learners suddenly seem quite trivial compared to inserting a device into someone's chest.
Experimenting tomorrow.
Get the scalpel out.
So I will finish up with mine, and it is an inane piece of trivia. Regular listeners will know that I've been listening to the Song by Song podcast lately, which covers Tom Waits' musical discography one song at a time. So there are hundreds of episodes of this. I'm now well into his 1977 album Foreign Affairs, and just listened to an episode on the song Burma Shave. Do either of you know what Burma Shave is?
No.
I don't.
No, so I hadn't either. I hadn't heard of the brand, but I'd heard of the advertising gimmick. So it's a brand of shaving cream, and what they did was they would have 6 highway billboards spaced equal distances apart. So as you were driving across the US, you would see a message come up one after the other. So you'd get stuff like a shave, that's real, no cuts to heal, a soothing velvet afterfeel, Burma Shave. And then this went on for about 40 years, something like this. And they started to bring in safety messages. So they'd have, if you dislike big traffic fines, slow down, till you can read these signs, Burma Shave. And these became so famous that eventually they had one that said, if you don't know whose signs these are, you can't have driven very far. So they didn't even include the brand name anymore in these signs. So I just thought that was a cool piece of American trivia, and utterly inane compared to what you guys had to say. And that's it. That's all from us. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on this show, you can tweet me at Ross Garner GP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
And you can tweet Mirjam.
It's Mirjam N, Mirjamn.
For more from Good Practice, or to check out our award-winning performance support toolkit and beautifully designed e-learning, visit goodpractice.com. You can also find us on Twitter at GoodPractice or at GoodPracticeAUS. Next week, after a bit of shuffling around, we are going to be hosting Joe Wainwright and sharing our experiences of coaching. To make sure you don't miss it, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mirjam. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much again for having me.
And thank you, Owen.
Thank you.
Until next time, bye for now.